Beautiful. All right, and as you saw, we are going to be recording this meeting both in English and Spanish so that folks are able to watch it and learn from the wonderful Jacey. So first of all, again, thank you so much for being here tonight. We are very excited for this event. We wanted to also have a friendly reminder to mute yourself if you're not talking, just to reduce that background noise, make sure the recording is as good as possible and the experience is as good as possible. So many of you already know the wonderful Jacey Anderson. Jacey was introduced to Sister Cities by Professor Molly Todd when she was a student at Montana State University. And she also spent time as a volunteer with Sister Cities in Arkatal. And she was actively involved in the popular education workshops and then hired on the staff of Sister Cities in 2018. And sadly, as you all probably know, she will be ending her time as staff at the end of this month in order to pursue work as a full-time historian. And we are very sad to see her go, but overjoyed that she was able to spend so many years with us as staff and that she is able to share her research with us tonight. And Jacey just graduated last week from MSU with her PhD in history. So I think that deserves a huge round of applause. Congratulations, Jacey. A lot to celebrate tonight. Her research shares the history of resource conflict and rural organizing in 2 river basins in the Americas. She tracks how the people of each place use their local knowledge of the land to successfully prevent mining projects in the late 20th century. And with that, I will pass it over to Jacey.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I'm super humbled to give this presentation with many people who are involved in the movements I'm about to talk about. This is pretty much the presentation I gave for my dissertation defense, and I practiced doing it really fast. So I'll be sharing my screen, and so like Emma or someone, if I'm going too fast, just unmute and yell at me, and I'll rein it in. Okay, so let's get going.
And Jacey, one question before you get started. So is the recording that you are doing to the cloud? Because it looks like we are not able to record
okay.
unless it's to the cloud.
It's to the cloud.
Perfect. All right.
Okay.
Thank
you. Okay. Can you all see this okay? Can you hear me okay? All right. Cool. So as Emma said, this is an environmental history of 2 river basins in the Americas. And I looked at how people used their local knowledge of the land to successfully prevent mining projects in southeastern Montana and northeastern El Salvador in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in the case of Montana, people along the Tongue River successfully prevented a coal hauling railroad from being constructed. And with that, a lot of coal development would have happened. So they were able to prevent that from ever being built. And then in the case of El Salvador, rural organizers fought against gold mining until it reached the national level, and El Salvador became the first country in the world to ban metal mining. And so by putting these two places together, I looked at how environmental, societal, and economic factors led to these successes. And I look at them from different scales, from the global to the local, and highlight common themes they shared. So one was that people defended their watersheds from mining projects that would have damaged water quality and altered local residents' ways of life. The leaders of both movements were not traditional environmentalists and didn't necessarily consider themselves to be, but they were ordinary rural working people who fought for what they believed in, a life of dignity and respect for their surroundings. They used their local knowledge of working the land to advocate for change, and they created strategic relationships around mutual interests. And each of these places played the long game. Each of these movements lasted for over 3 decades. So by looking at 2 case studies, I argue that these success stories aren't just singular anomalies, but they can be repeated and serve as models for present day organizers. And they also show what Indigenous scholars and organizers from the so-called global South have argued for a long time, that environmental and social justice are linked and cannot be separated. And again, I have so much gratitude to so many people. And for tonight's purpose, I want to especially thank the Northern Plains Resource Council for working with me to help tell their story, and then U.S. El Salvador Sister Cities and Criptes for, again, working with me and allowing me to tell this story. And I'll get to that more further on. So to situate myself in the story a bit and how these 2 places ended up on my radar. After graduating with my undergrad degree, I had an internship with U.S. El Salvador Sister Cities, and Katie Chambers and I were placed in Arcatao in the Department of Chalatenango along the Honduran border. And our main role was to work with the Comité de Memoria Histórica Sobreviviente, the Surviving Historic Memory Committee, and just accompany different goings-on of the community. So while we were there, the community was organizing to hold a vote, a consulta popular, to determine whether they wanted to allow mining in their town or not. And they asked sister cities and others to accompany this process by organizing an international delegation of observers. And I know I'm preaching to the choir a lot here, but we have folks from Montana and El Salvador, so bear with me. But the role of our delegation that we were organizing was to observe this process, lend validity to the process, amplify that this was happening so it could reach different news sources, and most importantly, accompany the community regardless of what they decided. And after being here several months, I was not surprised that Arcatao voted against mining, but I was surprised that the vote was almost unanimous. There was only 1 vote in favor of mining out of the entire community. And being from Montana, growing up in Montana, I just kept thinking this would never happen in my home state. We're the treasure state. Our flag here has a shovel, pick, and axe that says oro y plata, gold and silver. In my working memory, our state had always passed to encourage mining and never had voted against anything like that. And so in my mind, it was just like, this would never happen where I'm from. And when I went to grad school and started looking more closely at the environmental movement in El Salvador, and then eventually took up the Montana case study as well, I learned I was actually really wrong, that there were more things in common between the places than what divided them. So this is just a slide of how I organized the dissertation with 2 case studies. In the intro, chapter 1 and conclusion, they're side by side, and then chapters 2 and 3 kind of split them apart. And I'm happy, if anyone wants to read the dissertation, I will send it to you. But that's all we'll touch upon for today. And for today's purpose, I'll start with a little bit of background, some definitions, situate ourselves geographically, and a teeny bit of theory just to show how we might look at these 2 places simultaneously. And then I'm going to break down several strategies that were parallel between both case studies. And then at the end, I'll talk about why history and remembering matter. And that's its own like separate organizing strategy as well. So when I say the word environment, I am including humans, unless I specifically say the non-human environment or landscape. And when I use the word community, I am including the non-human environment, unless I otherwise specify. And then campesino, campesina is more or less a rural subsistence farmer. The Northern Plains Resource Council was the main organization I'm talking about in the Montana case, and that's abbreviated as MPRC, or colloquially Northern Plains. And then, of course, CREEP-based, many of you know about CREEP-based. The Christian Committee of the Displaced is the historic acronym, or the Association for the Development of El Salvador is today's acronym. So hope you memorize that, because we're not going back. Just kidding. Just ask in the chat if you have questions. Okay. So the Tongue River watershed is located in one of the least densely populated places in the lower 48 states of the US. The people along its basin are spaced out by multi-acre ranches, or a key place in this story too is this yellow on the west bank is the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And it's considered a semi-arid steppe climate, has little rainfall with harsh winters, and the average temperature is well below freezing for over a quarter of the year. And under the Tongue River, there's a coal bed, and the coal is what filters the water. And the water is then what makes this region ripe for agriculture, and specifically cattle ranching. Meanwhile, if we travel 48 kilometers to the south, we will find the Rio Lempa. And it begins in Guatemala and runs across most of El Salvador, which is the most densely populated country in all of Latin America. And then it empties into the Pacific Ocean. 3 out of every 4 Salvadorans live within the river basin, using it to fish, irrigate crops, wash clothing, swim, and the like. And of course, El Salvador is a tropical climate with a wet and dry season where it's warm year round, with temperatures averaging 31 degrees Celsius or 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And almost parallel to the river here is the Central American Gold Belt. So this juxtaposition of river with mineral and demand is part of what led to these conflicts that I looked at. And so just a little theory to ground us. There's the well-worn dependency theory and economic underdevelopment. So to try to just break this down simply, at the core, we have wealthy countries, and the periphery are places that have resources. And so in this dynamic, the core goes to these countries with resources, takes the resources away, makes goods with them, and sells them back to the periphery. And this creates a dynamic of disparity. And in economic underdevelopment, this whole idea of we have developing nations, well, those nations stay poor because of this relationship. It just accentuates that divide of wealth. So these are really well-examined theories. And what I'm doing with these two case studies is showing that this dynamic isn't just nation state to nation state, but can happen at different scales. So in the Montana case, reservation is its own sovereign nation within the US. That creates its own dynamic. And in both places, there's a rural-urban divide also that has this dynamic. And then my main argument there is the people in both of these movements were aware of this dynamic, and they were in the so-called periphery and actively fought to change the status quo. And so now we get to the fun part, the strategies. And so the first strategy that's really in common with both of these places is the ability to adapt and play the long game. So the 1970s was it was a time of conflict in the US, and Montana is a great place to observe this conflict. So the so-called oil crisis in the 1970s led people to look for alternative energy sources, and coal was one they turned to because of its accessibility within the borders of the US. At the same time, things like the Clean Air Act of 1970 came about to start to regulate these extractive processes. And then in Montana, Montanans rewrote their constitution in 1972, and they added, most famously, that Montanans had the right to a, quote, clean and healthful environment. So that same year, the North Central Power Study took place, and this was a study conducted by the US Bureau of Reclamation and 21 private and public utility companies, electric cooperatives, public power districts, and cities. And the plan proposed 42 new coal-burning power plants in the Northern Great Plains. 21 of those would be in Montana, and most along the Tongue River. So if you remember the map from earlier, this is where the Tongue River watershed is. And so the plan relied on using water from the Yellowstone, Bighorn, Wind, Tongue, Powder, and North Platte rivers to cool the plants. Ranchers from Burney, Bullhead Mountain, and Rosebud Creek attended the meeting. And when they saw this report, to them it appeared that their valley would become a sacrifice zone to fuel the nation. And they knew this would change not just the way they operated their ranches for generations, but it would also make the land incapable of supporting vegetation and cattle. And the next slide shows, this is the origin story of the Northern Plains Resource Council. And one of their famous images is this rawhide where they created this sign that's like, we're not going to be your sacrifice zone, basically. And on the side are the branding marks of the different ranches. And so in this context, a venture capitalist named Mike Gustafson had the idea to create a railroad that paralleled the river. And the only purpose was to shorten the distance to bring Wyoming coal to market, which there already was an established route. His idea was to get investors to build this new railroad to shorten the route and make it more efficient, and then open more coal mines along the Tongue River. And so in El Salvador, there's a similar strategy of adaptability and the long game. So mining, of course, had been a part of El Salvador history for centuries, but it paused during the Civil War. And during the 12-year conflict from 1980 to 1992, thousands of people fled the country as refugees. Many lived in United Nations refugee camps in Honduras. According to the United Nations Truth Commission, about 1/3 of the entire population either left the country or were internally displaced at this time. And before the war had officially ended, Salvadorans living in these camps organized to repopulate their homeland. Frustrated by the lack of communication and understanding from the Honduran and Salvadoran governments and the UN, the Salvadorans living abroad began to leverage international solidarity to go home and move forward with their lives. And so this is the origin story of Criptes and US El Salvador Sister Cities is the international solidarity piece of that. And so the first people to repopulate went to Chalatenango along the Rio Lempa. And I also point to this because in the refugee camps, people started to build these networks of organizing to leverage for adequate food, health, education, and the like. And this legacy is really, I argue, what carried through the anti-mining campaign. So a second common strategy is people using their knowledge from being with working the land to eventually take legal action. And so here's an example, Elena Buffalo Spirit. She's a member of the Northern Cheyenne. She also served on the board for the Northern Plains Resource Council for many years. She's a journalist, activist, and artist. And I'm just going to play a little bit of her story here to make this point.
Okay, Northern Plains was always, I had known about it, but I didn't know too much about Northern Plains until one day.
Can you hear that okay?
Yes.
Me and my little doggy Coco were walking along the river where my family owns land, and it's so beautiful down there. It's serene. It's in the alluvial valley. It's undisturbed. That's where we have our ceremonies even today. And we were walking along the river, and I thought, I'm going to watch to see if she'll take a drink of the water. And she was walking along, and pretty soon she took a little drink, and the water was really clean and clear. And I thought, you know, I'm gonna join Northern Plains because I really like how clean my water is here. Okay, Northern Plains was always, I had known about it, but I didn't know too much about Northern Plains until one day me and my little doggy Coco were walking. So when I joined Northern Plains Resource Council, I immediately started learning so much about the environment. That's one of the best things about Northern Plains Resource Council. I learned so much about the environment, the laws to protect our land, water, air. To me, in my life, that's the best thing I ever did for my homeland here. And then there were, I got involved with all the
And so another example of people using local knowledge of the land to take legal actions is in 1990, landowners started to receive these notices from the Tongue River Railroad Company that the company was going to enter their land. And to organize, Northern Plains sent out this landowner survey, and they were asking landowners, like, did the company enter your land? Are you for or against this railroad? Just kind of gathering general thoughts and information along the valley of what was going on. And in the responses in these surveys, you see people really pointing to their knowledge of the land. So this one says we've been held hostage by the company. This one talks about they're against the railroad. They think it would be environmentally bad for water quality, crop yields. It would be bad for wildlife. It would bring in weeds, spread fire. Air quality would decline due to the new coal mines. And then some people were less verbose, and this person just says against because it's a needless piece of crap. And in both case studies, you see really involved educational campaigns. So with the Northern Plains, every year they held this Bernie barbecue, and they would invite people from along the valley just to give updates of what was happening so people could share their own experiences. And then organizers at Northern Plains would say, hey, this is what we know about what the company is doing. Here's how we can organize. And this is just some example of educational materials that they would share throughout the valley about property rights, and here's your rights when someone tries to go onto your land. And so in El Salvador, there's a parallel here with people knowing the land motivates them to care for it. And Sulma is here, and she's agreed to speak to her own story, which is awesome. But I'll just share a little bit about the context of the photo here. So during the repopulation, a lot of people got to own land for the first time, and they would work that for their livelihoods. And this is a photo in Sinquera, and Sinquera was one of the early communities to also ban metal mining. So Soma, if you would like to share, she's going to share in Spanish.
Hola, ¿me pueden escuchar?
Sí.
Bueno, primero, gracias Jacey por la oportunidad de compartir un poco la experiencia de la comunidad de Sinquera en Cabañas, que también es una comunidad hermanizada con Chicago. Y similar a la experiencia que compartía, Sinquera fue una comunidad que quedó completamente destruida después de el conflicto armado. Entonces, en el 91, comunidades, siete familias deciden repoblar el pueblo que estaba totalmente destruido, y después del conflicto, después de los acuerdos de paz, estos campesinos que habían sido desplazados reciben parcelas de tierra. Entonces, en la organización comunitaria se decide que, pues, qué van a hacer con esas tierras que estos campesinos han recibido, ¿verdad? Porque muchos de ellos no tenían como los insumos para cultivar, para sembrar maíz o frijoles. Entonces, cuando en el proceso de organización también se opta por cuidar el medio ambiente, por cuidar la montaña de Sinquera. La razón principal fue porque la mayoría de personas que repoblaron el pueblo fueron excombatientes, fueron guerrilleros, que durante el conflicto armado estuvieron en la lucha, en las batallas, en la montaña de Sinquera. Entonces, había un sentimiento de conexión entre los combatientes, las guerrilleras y guerrilleros, con la montaña de Sinquera. Entonces decían, estos arbolitos nos protegieron durante el conflicto, y si ahora decidimos sembrar frijoles y maíz, significa que vamos a talar árboles. Entonces ahora que ya estamos en tiempo de paz, es nuestra oportunidad de volver un poco, de cuidar esta montaña, de cuidar estos árboles. Y fue así que cuando ya se tenía una organización legal en el municipio, se crea una ordenanza municipal para prohibir la tala de árboles y prohibir también la extracción de animales, ¿verdad? Animales del río, del bosque. Entonces, eso ayudó para que la comunidad también fuera manteniendo la memoria histórica viva, la organización, y aparte para cuidar, cuidar el medio ambiente, ¿verdad? Porque se daba esa orientación a las personas de todas las edades, de cómo cuidar el medio ambiente, de cómo proteger el bosque, cómo mantenerlo vivo. Y yo recuerdo que cuando yo era pequeña, allí en el pueblo, em, nos llevaban, cuando íbamos a catequesis, los fines de semana, nos llevaban a leer la Biblia a la montaña y muchas veces ni entendíamos por qué, pero cuando ya estábamos allá, ya nos contaban un poco de historia, nos iban diciendo, en este lugar falleció fulanito de tal, o asesinaron a no sé quién, o hubo una emboscada. Y entonces, y así fue también pasando esa información de generación en generación, debido a la, o gracias a la organización comunitaria de ese tiempo, y ahora pues tenemos un bosque bastante grande que se ha mantenido ya por quizás ya 30 años aproximadamente. Se sigue trabajando para mantenerlo, para evitar las quemas, principalmente durante la época seca, y ahora ya es una opción turística para personas de la misma comunidad y personas de comunidades alrededor del pueblo para disfrutar, ¿verdad?, de la naturaleza y también para crear conciencia del cuidado del medio ambiente. Eso. Gracias, Jaycee.
Thank you, Soma.
Entonces,
Oops, that was the recorded version in case Soma wasn't here. So like Montana, El Salvador had a really, the anti-mining campaign had a really robust education campaign. So to hold a consulta popular in your community was a 5-step process. And CREEP-THIS was part of the anti-mining campaign and the National Roundtable Against Mining, or La Mesa. And so the poster at the right shows this 5-step process, and I'll break it down for you here. So step 1 was educate yourselves. And besides inner community meetings, communities will learn from other communities as well. So the photos on the right are from San Isidro, which was a fishing community, and they had gold mining in their community prior to the war. And cyanide was not properly taken care of by foreign companies, US Commerce Group, and leached into the water. So there would be different fish kills that the community shared with us. And then this meant they could no longer irrigate their crops. So they would have to either truck in water or rely on rainwater, which was becoming less predictable due to climate change. Step 2 was to collect 40% of the town's signatures in order to hold a vote. In the photo at the right is a volunteer committee in Arcatao who met and were verifying the signatures. Katie and I were there for part of that process. Step 3 then was to vote. And around the time of the vote, you would see different propaganda posters that said this is how you vote no for mining. And people would line up at their appropriate polls and cast their vote along with the international observation process. And then step 4, once you vote against mining, that creates a municipal ordinance in the town. And the photo at the right is right after Arcatao voted no to mining. Then step 5 would be to repeat the process in other communities until it reaches a national level, which it did. And in 2017, the Legislative Assembly voted no to mining, and El Salvador historically became the first country in the world to ban metal mining. So the third strategy is building alliances. And in the case of the Tongue River Railroad, the Northern Plains over the years were allied with coal mining unions, railroad unions who didn't want this railroad to be built because it would have cut off their jobs. Different tribes, the Northern Cheyenne was really embedded in the Northern Plains, so that was less of an alliance and more of a meshed entity, but there were a lot of other tribes that found solidarity within this story. And This really started at a local level. It was pretty radical that Northern Plains even came to be. So Jeannie Alderson on the left is a third generation rancher in Birdie, Montana. And she said in the early days, calling your neighbor was pretty radical. So you would meet with your neighbor every now and again to do different working like calving or branding, but you wouldn't really talk politics or anything personal. You would mind your own business. So when coal mining companies and the railroad companies started knocking on people's doors, they would say, hey, your neighbor sold out. And so Jeannie Alderson said that women were the first to really break this taboo and call their neighbor and say, hey, is it true? Did you sell your land to this company? And when the neighbor said no, this started to build solidarity among neighbors and eventually form the organization. And Teresa Erickson on the right was the executive director of Northern Plains for several decades. And when she first joined, she said, and learned about the Tongue River Railroad, she said, quote, oh my God, this is such a great issue because everybody's getting screwed. And she meant there's opportunity there to build alliances around common interests and goals. And so in El Salvador, as we saw through the war era, through the anti-mining campaign, Salvadoran organizers were very aware of the power of building alliances. So the La Mesa that I mentioned earlier was itself a group of different organizations that formed together around the mining issue. And then parallel to the Crete sister cities dynamic, they created international allies against mining in El Salvador to have that international support and amplify what was happening on the ground. And so finally, I just want to touch upon a final strategy, really, is what it is. For my defense, I called it methods, but when we look further, it's an organizing strategy within itself. I had the privilege of accessing private archives for both of these stories, and that's because both Cretes, sister cities, and Northern Plains knew the importance of understanding and documenting their history and having that be available for people to learn about their stories. So I'm going to just read the concluding paragraphs of my dissertation. I hope it's not a snooze fest, but then we get to the juicy discussion part. So here we go. Historical narratives are choices communities make and shape our beliefs in what the land is for us. In the United States, the US West in particular, mining can at times be glorified, a symbol of frontier, power, technology, and empire. This is a strategic construction. Deregulation becomes much easier when politicians and companies can tap into positive collective memory about mining. In the case of El Salvador, memories of centuries of oppression and resistance galvanized campesinos to organize against mining, but this cannot be taken for granted. Salvadoran journalist Roberto Lovato argues that El Salvador is under a, quote, state of amnesia, and the people are forgetting their past, as evidenced by support for a president who is arresting thousands of people without due process, including members of the anti-mining campaign. The Americas are an example of people under what sociologist Mike Onostario calls the fugue state, which generates collective ignorance. History and memory are antidotes to the process of forgetting. We were able to learn these stories because both Northern Plains and Cretes saw the benefit of keeping their documents and sharing their histories of resistance. They are advocates of unforgetting. They're revitalizing collective memory by formalizing their archives and encouraging historians like me to help tell their stories. This is a political act. By preserving their histories, Northern Plains and Cretes are democratizing knowledge, history, and memory. Present circumstances of social justice groups are determined by the past, so consciousness of their own history is essential. their archives, like all archives, are incomplete reflections of the past, yet they're also a way of leveraging people power to continue the struggle of protecting the land and ways of life. Thanks. So let's chat now. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but also many of you are experts in this history as well. So any reflections or shares are more than welcome here. Yes, Brian, Roberto Lovato's book is really good. Highly recommend. I love reading the writing of journalists. It's always really accessible and compelling. Yeah, John?
First, this is great work, Jacey. I'm wondering what thoughts you give it besides making this recording now of how to get this out to a broader. Well, I think a lot of people will be interested in this. Maybe not interested in reading your whole dissertation, although I am, but interested in the story. So I wonder if we've given any thought of how you might get that out more broadly.
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually a trickier question than it sounds. So I think this is the first step. And my research used what's called public history methodology, so working with the communities to tell these stories. And so I think it's up to the movements of what would be useful. So for the Montana case, they had specific goals. They said, we want this in Montana, the magazine of Western history. And one of my chapters will be in that magazine, which is exciting. It's an academic magazine, but it's also widely read by the public. And for the Salvador case, I don't know. I think this is one step in that process. And other than like written publications, I think that's pretty limiting to who will read those. So I'm open to ideas, basically. I don't know if anyone has ideas, please put them in the chat.
I have a follow-up question. Have you been in touch with Jan Morrill about this? Do you know Jan?
Not directly. I do know Jan, sort of.
Because this is her work
Right.
internationally. So just a thought.
Yeah, it's worth reaching out to her. Thank you for that.
John, I was thinking about Jan too, and being in El Salvador and being introduced to the people doing this work. What is she doing now?
I don't remember the name of the organization, but it works basically continuing the struggle against mineral mining worldwide. I'm going to her wedding in a few months, but we won't be discussing this probably. But I just think that it'd be a useful connection to make, because she might have some thoughts of where this information might be useful.
In the chat, Mario, fellow grad student, asked if I was able to find enough resources for my bibliography, or did I start from scratch? So the bibliography is interesting because for a lot of the primary sources, it was based in these private archives. And then for history, I don't know how it is with communications, Mario, but for history, you do like a historiography. So where does this story fit in other histories that have been told? So there is that was fun because it was US West and Latin America, and having those two places talk to each other, which hasn't been done much. So yeah, looking at both of those historiographies, and then early on thinking about how do those ideas talk to one another, because there's a lot of parallel patterns that you can put in both places, even though they have distinct histories in many ways, but there's, I think, more parallels than we've really thought about as far as like history of colonization and then resistance working the land is what I was looking at here. I saw Brian asked a question. Can anyone talk about cross-border organizing against metal mining in Central America? I don't think I can do that justice. Yeah, Rachel?
Well, I just want to say that I know, first of all, thank you so much, Jacey. This is really great. And I'm so glad you brought up, the two different cases, and because we have to link all the struggles together. Yeah, so what I know, there was the Mesa, right, before El Salvador was successful, there was the coordinated efforts throughout Central America. And I think some of the people from San Jose de las Flores is our sister city, Cambridge, San Jose de las Flores. Now it's Cambridge, Somerville, San Jose de las Flores. They actually sent people, I think, to Honduras to see what the effects were of the gold mining. And they came back and they convinced everybody and said, we cannot sell this land. We cannot allow this to happen, because we've seen what happens, how it destroys the land, and people can't drink the water, they can't farm, and we must stop it. And that was very successful. I don't know if Sulma, well, you probably know, of course, Jacey, through your research, but I believe it was 2014. And Jennifer and I were in the same delegation with the elections, and we had a chance to meet with the people who were doing this across the border organizing, as far as I recall. Please talk more about it, though, because I know in fact, a friend of mine who's Honduran just came back from Honduras, and she said her son lives right near a gold and silver mine, and it's continuing. Yeah.
Phil, and then we have a couple in the chat we can get to too.
Yeah, I think right now, I mean, the struggle is continuing in El Salvador, as I'm sure you're aware. There were 5 folks from Santa Marta that were very involved in the anti-mining campaign that were imprisoned on trumped up charges, supposedly of something they'd done during the war. And they're out temporarily, but they're still under threat, and they're still going before a judge. And I think there's that Nayib Bukele, the new populist authoritarian president, is moving towards, I think he would like to get rid of the anti-metallic mining law. And I think that that arresting the 5 people from Santa Marta is kind of the first step in that. He's also arrested, in excess of 70,000 people over the past 2 years, and has claimed that this was to combat gang violence, but it's really more, remilitarizing the country and terrorizing the population against organizing around things like the mining. So the struggle is definitely not over.
Thank you. There's a few more questions. I'm gonna do one more and then open it up to anyone out here who is in El Salvador or was part of either of these stories to share any final thoughts. But this question from Bob: considering that a small wealthy minority ruled El Salvador for many years, why was this popular referendum to ban mineral extraction successful? And so from what I saw by looking through a deep history, it was that strategy of a prolonged popular struggle. And so in my dissertation, I wanted to start with first contact with Europe, and then my advisor said no because I had to graduate at some point. But I did go to the 1932 uprising, where this struggle over land has existed for centuries, right? So this was a really clear moment in time when we saw this world resistance to these unequal power dynamics. And while that uprising was violently suppressed and led to ethnocide, people continued to organize clandestinely, and then that built up over the decades till we got to this pivotal moment in the war. And again, I feel like that those strategies carried through to the anti-mining campaign, and not a linear and then we kept getting better at organizing, but ebbed and flowed. And when you look back at the history, you can see this through line of popular struggle against this this unequal wealth distribution that Bob mentioned. So I just kind of want to open up the last couple minutes if anyone, I know we have Salvadorans out there, if anyone who has been directly involved in these movements wanted to share any thoughts. Okay, well, I'm going to put my email in the chat if anyone wants to talk further about questions, ideas to how we might share this story, and then I'm going to hand it off to Emma.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacey. And these were fantastic questions. So thank you all for your active participation. This was a really great event. Yeah, just really grateful to be able to be here tonight. So before we say goodbye for the evening, we would actually like to present Jacey with a gift for all of the care and love that you've put into not only your incredible dissertation and your work, but all your work with sister cities and your commitment to solidarity organizing. Personally, I can attest to the fact that I would not have gotten involved with sister cities as a volunteer if it wasn't for you. And I also wouldn't be a staff member now if it wasn't for you. So big thank you for all of your work to introduce me to this amazing network. And we will really, really miss your thoughtfulness and your willingness to step up and volunteer for all of the tasks, your great note-taking abilities, your sense of humor, your comforting presence. We will really miss you. So we are very, very lucky to have been able to work with you in this capacity and look forward to working with you again very soon. The coordinating team, which for folks who don't know what that is, it is like the steering committee or executive committee of the network, wanted to give you a gift that reflects our international solidarity work and your impact on it these last few years. So we have commissioned a embroidery from Salvadoran artists, and it's not finished yet. So this is just like an example of what it will look like, but we can share a draft. Let me just share my screen here. There we go. So we hope to get this embroidery to you in June, and we hope that every time you look at it, you will be reminded of us and the struggle for life.
Ooh, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
Yes.
That's so
And
cool.
Yeah, very excited to have a picture of you with that. And lastly, thank you everybody for attending. If you are interested in getting more involved with this work, definitely reach out. Jacey put her email in the chat. Sure that you also have our emails. I can drop my email too. And we also have an upcoming delegation, well, multiple delegations, but one in particular with the Lawrence, Kansas and El Papaturo committee. They are looking for more participants to participate in that delegation from July 21st to 28th. You can find that event and others on our website that I also dropped in the chat. And also a big thank you for all of their interpretation tonight and other events, Booch and Brenda. So if we could all come off mute and give a big round of applause to Jacey and Booch and Brenda, we can say goodnight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Mil gracias.
Thank you.
Felicitaciones. Qué maravilla.